We've all experienced the effect of putting on something that makes you feel good, and then you sort of just assume that you're that better version of yourself. But now there's actually scientific data showing that there is a cognitive effect. I have the honor of being joined by Karen Franklin. Could you please introduce yourself?
Certainly, lovely to be here. I've worked in and around the fashion industry for 42 years. I began life as a magazine fashion editor and co-editor, and then as a journalist I moved into broadcast, so I spent 15 years in total with the BBC, 12 years on the BBC's Close show, huge global audience, and I've spent my time really being interested not just in fashion but also identity, which is why I took a Master of Science in Psychology about 10 years ago.
I guess my first question to you would be, what is enclothed cognition?
I'm glad you asked. It's a term that we're actually quite familiar with because it got a huge amount of press when the authors Adam and Galinsky released their study in 2012. So it's a phenomenon that describes the ability of clothes to affect our cognitive process, not our feelings or our moods, although we know that they can do that too, but to actually impact on our mental process. And the reason that, when we dig deeper into that, that happens, it's because they addressed the symbolic meaning of the clothes along with the process of actually wearing them. So you're going to ask me how they did that study, aren't you?
Of course.
So they chose a white lab coat, and they split the study into two participant groups, and one group wore the lab coat and one group wore their street clothes. Now, what you don't do in any psychological study is you tell people, so what we're going to test for is this. Sure. Because then people deliver the answers they think you want because they want to be helpful. So people didn't know that this was specific to the test, and both groups of people were given what's called a Stroop test. It's a very simple cognitive test that has two confusing elements to it. And what happened was that those wearing the scientists' white lab coat delivered 50% less errors than those in street clothes. So what we can infer from that was the symbolic meaning of the scientist in her lab coat, or his lab coat, and the attention to detail, the concentration, the hypervigilance that we associate with those professions. We actually also felt that it rubbed off on the garment itself. And so it wasn't a choice for people to decide, I'm going to concentrate more because I'm wearing this special coat, or I'm in my street clothes, I'm not going to concentrate. It was actually the brain as an unconscious decision maker processing everything it knew about the symbolic meaning of those clothes and then the wearing of them.
That's such a fascinating distinction because we've all experienced the effect of putting on, something that makes you feel good, and then you sort of just assume that you're that better version of yourself. But now there's actually scientific data showing that there is a cognitive effect. You might actually perform better depending on what you wear.
If we've previously talked about the fit and the feel, we're now talking about the meaning of them and the fact that the brain reaches back and retrieves all this information about what this garment stands for and how that might impact on us.
I hope our governments aren't listening because they're going to want us all dressed in suits so we're a more productive society and all that stuff. But it got to a point during COVID where I was launching a business, and a lot of my professional life was happening at home, and for a period of time that was, I was doing that in joggers and, a hoodie, essentially, a jumper. But I got fed up, and I just felt like my output wasn't where it could be. So I started to, halfway through COVID, dress up a little bit. I put on chinos and an Oxford cloth button-down shirt and tuck it in, and, even put on a jacket. And, I felt more productive, and it would be interesting, had I known about this study at the time, to actually see if my productivity increased.
You didn't have a team of scientists following you
No.
and evaluating your output, but you instinctively felt it.
Yeah.
You felt you needed to associate with the properties of clothes that made you feel more upright, perhaps more formal in your approach, rather than, oh, I'll do that later, who cares? And we can see this across the board with more everyday items. So that one obvious example is when we buy into sportswear, for instance. We've already invested something. Let's take an item of footwear. If we know that it's been designed by mechanic or industrial engineers, and it's designed using kind of data that's come from NASA around optimizing speed, and it's created with a very contemporary design of neons, or we expect that shoe to supercharge our athletic performance. We've bought into that shoe to do that. Similarly, there's a really interesting study where people split into two groups. One group was wearing a Superman t-shirt, and the other group was simply wearing the same colours in a t-shirt but without the logo. And they were set various tasks, and some of them were anticipation tasks. So what they found was, in the group that were wearing the Superman t-shirt, their anticipation of their ability to, for instance, lift heavier weights was higher. They believed that they could, oh no, actually I could lift that, I could do that. Then the people in the ordinary t-shirt chose lower weights as their optimum weight.
I mean, I'm an avid runner, and the thing with running now are these like carbon plates in your running shoes. It's meant to make you go faster, and I've gotten faster since I've gotten the shoes, and I've also, I think, been willing to also push myself harder than I did before, because I know I have this tech in my shoes. So, I think there's an element of, both there, right?
Yeah, agreed, totally. And let's kind of take that back to, say, the garment, where if we know that we're wearing a garment that has perhaps been crafted in an artisanal way, crafted with care, that fabrics have been chosen with thought in the same way that you just named some of the materials in your running shoe, and that we understand something about the make of a garment and what it is that it's going to deliver. If we know that, then we take that in and have an expectation of how that garment's going to make us feel, as opposed to if we've perhaps bought a garment and we don't know its story, but we know we got it for a really good deal, and possibly we understand that it doesn't have a kind of vintage heritage or an artisanal heritage, then we don't have any story to put on.
What we're learning is that belief is a very powerful concept. Has that worked its way into any recent collections lately? And if so, can you talk about that a little bit?
I'm glad you asked. Rather unusually, I noticed that a very recent Yves Saint Laurent had featured capes as part of his menswear. Now, we're not thinking immediately the superhero hooded cape, but they were very beautiful, made in the same fabric as sort of evening dress suits, with quite a long sort of swishy feel to them, incredibly elegant. But for all of us, we channel those properties, like the scientific lab coat. That person has a certain level of education and application to important tasks. We channel the properties of the cape, which is that kind of majestic, royalty wear capes, a sort of supernatural, and also that sort of superhero element of capes allowing for flight. And being protective, maybe even being bulletproof. Now, we're not consciously summoning all this, but it's already in our memory, and our brain retrieves it as a reference point to understand what we're seeing.
So it's that belief, I mean, knowing that that's in the back of your mind, believing that sort of then is maybe outwardly displayed in the way you carry yourself. Obviously, you're not going to be flying around the room or something like that.
You can have a go.
You can. I wouldn't suggest it, but you could. But maybe just in the way you carry yourself. You carry yourself a little bit more like.
No question. You know, you're thinking about your overall presentation and the clothes that you're wearing. So, yes, you would be holding yourself with a certain amount of majesty, I think.
That's so fascinating. Well, we hope that you learned something about Enclothed Cognition. I'm personally curious what your idea of a Superman t-shirt is, so why don't you let me know in the comments below, and please don't forget to subscribe.